going to Hawaii today, down Island.
Okay.
And so she's gonna be home alone for at least a week or so.
Oh, my goodness.
Huh? Yes,
Maybe they could find somebody that can sit with her.
I'm sure they make some arrangements, I have no idea what they are.
Okay. I'll make.
She can call the house, I'm sure she'll answer.
All right. Well, I'll make the passes aware of that. So let's jump into Judges. Before we get into the new stuff, as we always do, we get into the previous stuff. And so last week, what we talked about was Micah and his idol, right? And so, how did he make his idol? Like, how did he make it?
He stole them, didn't he?
Yeah, he stole it. What did he steal?
He stole gold from the
Shekels.
Yeah, the shekels, the silver from his mother. He stole it from her, and then she made a curse, and then he gave it back and said, "Look, Mom, I took it. It's all good now." Right? How many pieces of shekels was it? 1,100. And what other character does that 1,100 shekels remind us of?
Delilah.
Yep. Delilah. That's right. And so he gets the coins, and his mom actually dedicates it to the Lord. And how much does she give to the Lord of the 1,100?
200.
200, right. And then they make a golden, not a golden image, but more of an idol out of an engraven image out of it. And so then Micah puts it in his house, and he puts it with the rest of his household gods, right? And so he makes an ephod, idol, and he has household gods. And then what happens next? There's this thing about this Levite, right? And what does Micah do with the Levite?
He makes him his priest of the day.
Yep, he makes him the priest. So who was this Levite? Do you remember?
It's from the book of the tribe of Dan.
Moses' grandson.
Moses' grandson.
No, I take it back. The Levites didn't have a tribe.
Right, Levites didn't have, well, they had a tribe, but they didn't have an inheritance.
They didn't have any land.
Exactly, exactly. But he was from the area of Judah. And if you remember his name, let's see if I can find it here. He was Moses' grandson. Do you remember that part?
Yes.
So this is Moses' grandson who comes there. And then what happens after that? What's the next part of the story?
They started going north.
Right, Dan sends a place up north, sends spies up north, and on their way they come to Micah's house and they discover the Levite. And how do they know that it's the Levite?
His voice.
His voice, right, his diction, his vernacular, his speech. And so they go up north, they find the people at peace, the land is prosperous, there's nobody to defend them or support them. They come back to their territory, the Danite spies, and then a tribe of Dan, about 600 members of the tribe, so not the entire tribe, but part of it, then travels up north. And when they get to Micah's house, what do?
They take it out.
They take it all. But who took his ephod and idols? The priest. The priest did, right? And what was the way that they got the priest to join them? What did they tell them? Do you remember?
They were gonna give him a good job and more money.
Good job and more money, right? Yep. More people. Is it better for you to be the priest over this family or over a whole clan and tribe? The promotion, right? When we talked about promotions in the church and pastors. And so then afterwards, Micah runs out after the people and he says, "Wait, you've taken everything from me," right? Which shows that everything in his mind was his idolatrous acts. And so the people settled up north and they conquered that area. They completely destroy it and wipe it out. They put it to the fire and then they rebuilt it and they called that place Dan, which became the shrine, if you will, of idolatrous worship in the northern kingdom of Israel when the kingdom separated from Solomon's sons. And so that's the story of how the shrine in Dan got set up. Any questions on the recap? No? Okay. So this week, I don't know if you were as disturbed as I was, but how many of us read 19 through 21? Okay, a good bit of it. So one of the things about myself is that and Chantel knows this, whenever there is a scene of rape or gang rape, it deeply bothers me to where I can't watch the television. I have to cut it off. And if I'm reading it, I have to just skim the pages. And so to have read this in God's Word was very troubling to me and disturbing. And it was hard. I don't know if it was hard for anybody else, but it was really hard for me. And so, how was the reading for you all this week? What is something that kind of stood out?
Too violent.
Too violent. Exactly. Too violent.
And I was wondered, being a woman, why it was better you would throw it and protect the man, but you'd send your wife or your daughter out to be raped and killed.
Yeah.
And that was honorable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That irritated the heck out of me.
Yeah. Why was it more honorable for you to protect the visitor and the man than your own daughter?
Well, first off, you're supposed to protect the one that you've accepted into your home. And Sodom was even one of worse than just plain rape.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They did the same thing with Lot,
Yeah. Yeah.
Lot was there, so.
In some cases, if they made a death, they could give away their wife or their kids or even themselves sometimes for a period of time. That's the way they pay
Well,
the,
in the Bible, but it's still going on today in the world, not
Yeah.
here, but it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't have that value.
Yeah. That's a good point. Not only is it in the text, but it also occurs in life today. And sometimes that's the problematic part when you're reading, when I was reading Judges, is I would read it and then I would say, it sounds just like the world today. And in some way, it definitely was that too.
Maybe that's why we read it.
That's a good point. That's a good point. Anything, let's see, any other verses that just really struck a chord with you?
I mean, divide somebody up, send them out to other places, it's like, when you think about something like that, it's impossible to even comprehend.
Yeah, it is. It is. Sorry, online viewers. Just gonna tell you this now. So, I feel like teaching this a little differently than just standing up and over you. So how about we just try to walk through this together? Is that okay? Because this is tough. So, and what I appreciate about the author is the author did not spare the details. The author throughout the story of Judges has been very acute and very specific to let us know this is what really happened during the time. This is God's people, right? But at the same time, this is what God's people can do when there was no king and they did what was right in their own eyes. And so in chapter 19, the very first line that we read is it says, in those days, Israel had no king. So it's just preface, right? It's a disclaimer. Hey, what you're about to read, just know there was no king during this time. And so a Levite who lived in a remote area in the hill country of Ephraim, he took a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. Does anybody know what a concubine is?
Well, it's legal,
Right.
and children are legally his,
Mm-hmm.
but his children can't inherit.
Right, right. So what a concubine is a woman who is almost like a surrogate mother who can do that, but is also a woman who is to produce children for the man. And sometimes her children may share in his inheritance, but oftentimes the woman definitely won't. Growing up, I always thought a concubine was a prostitute, but they're different in a way. And so this priest, he takes for himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. And this is, again, notice where the concubine is from. She is from Israel. And it says that she was unfaithful to him, and she left him and went back to her parents' home in Bethlehem. After she had been there for months, her husband went to her to persuade her to come with him. So I don't know why it took him 4 months to go after his wife, but he definitely did that. And he had a servant and 2 donkeys and all these people, and his father-in-law, the woman's father, prevailed on him to stay. In verse 5, the 4th day they got up early and prepared to leave, but the woman's father said to his son-in-law, refresh yourself with something to eat. Why do you think that the father-in-law wanted the son to stay?
So he could protect his daughter from what was ahead, maybe protect her from death, maybe.
Protect her from death, protect her from him. Yeah.
Maybe he didn't have a son and he wanted a relationship.
Yeah. Maybe you just wanted a relationship.
But back in these days, did these men have multiple wives?
They did. And what actually would happen is you would have a wife and then you would have concubines.
But that's not multiple wives, what you just said. I mean, actually married to, more than one.
Yeah, some of them would. Some of them would. And so he does this. How many times has he asked the son to stay?
About 5 times,
Yeah, about 3 times.
one time, and they were eating and drinking and having a good time.
Mm-hmm. Yep, eating and drinking, having a good time, entertaining. And then in verse 8, on the 5th day he rose to go, but then the father kept him longer. And then verse 9, the man with his concubine got up to leave. The father said, it's almost evening. Spend the night here. The day is going to be over. But what does the man do?
He rose and departed.
Yeah, he rose and departed. In verse 10, he was unwilling to stay another night, and so the man left and went toward Jabez, Jerusalem. So notice the context there. He's leaving in the evening time, which means that he has less time to travel to where he needs to go. And he's trying to get home back in the hill country of Ephraim, which some believe is about 6 to 8 miles from where he is there in Bethlehem. And so he then, when they were near Jesus, the day was almost gone. The servant said, come, let's stop at the city and spend the night. But what does the man respond to staying in Jerusalem or into Jabez?
Says we'll spend the night in Eva.
Yeah. Right. And why does he want to spend the night there and not Jebus?
Because he's not Jewish.
Yeah. He says, we won't go into any city whose people are not Israel. We will go on to Gibeah or Gibeah. And so they tried to reach there. And so they went on, and the sun set as they neared it. So it's already nighttime. And there they stopped to spend the night. They went in and sat in the city square. And finally, an old man came, and he took them in. And he said to them in verse 19 that, hey, we have everything, so you don't really need to provide a lot to take care of us. We just need a place to stay. And then in verse 20, he says, you're welcome at my house. Let me supply whatever you need. So he took him into his house and fed his donkeys. And while they were enjoying themselves, some of the wicked men of the city surrounded the house, pounding on the door, shouted to the old man who owned the house, bring out the man who came to your house so we can have sex with him. So what do you think is going on in this text here?
It shows that everybody did whatever they wanted to do.
Everywhere.
My King James Version says that we may know him. That's sex, is that what you're saying?
Yes, sir. Yeah, to know somebody in a biblical understanding was to lay with them. Nice way of putting it.
It was a trap. The old man had some kind of, let's turn him in, I'm gonna get some money, or is it a trade going on there?
It could be. It could be that he turned them in. Yeah, so what other story does this remind us of in the Bible?
Law.
Yeah, the story of Lot.
Sodom and Gomorrah.
Right.
When you see what the worth of the man and the concubine were too.
Mm-hmm. You do.
Marquis,
Yes.
he was on his way to Shiloh to make a sacrifice,
Mm-hmm.
which was very, very important.
Right.
But he stopped along the way for 5 to 6 days with his father-in-law
Mm-hmm.
instead of going on. So he was doing all kinds of things instead of going straight to Shiloh.
Yeah.
So he was not really that serious about the trip to Shiloh.
Yeah.
Am I reading something wrong there?
I don't believe so. I'm not sure where I see Shiloh in the text, but Shiloh was in the area of
It's 1918.
1918. Oh yeah, you're right. Yeah, and now I'm going to the house of the Lord. You're right. So he's trying to get his concubine and go back to work, basically. Going back to the house of God. And so the owner of the house went outside and said to them, "No, my friends, don't be so vile, since this man is my guest. Don't do this outrageous thing. Look, here's my virgin daughter and his concubine. I will bring them out to you now, and you can use them to do to them whatever you wish. But as for this man, don't do such an outrageous thing."
We don't think too much of women, obviously.
Yep.
Right.
Well, they were property.
Take this girl.
Yeah. Doesn't that just disturb you?
Yeah.
The outrageous thing in the text is not that he gave his virgin daughter or the concubine, but that they would have sex with the man. And so, but the man would not listen to him. So the man took his concubine and sent her outside to them. And they abused her throughout the night. And at dawn, they let her go. At daybreak, the woman went back to the house where her master was staying, fell down at the door, and lay there until daylight. And when her master got up in the morning and opened the door of the house and stepped out to continue his way, there lay his concubine, fallen in the doorway of the house, with her hands on the threshold. And what did he say to her?
Tell them, get up, let's go. Let's go.
All he says is, "Get up, let's go." This woman has just been violated, completely destroyed, locked out of the house, and all he says is, "Get up, let's go." And so he puts her on his donkey, and he set out for home. When I was reading this commentary here on the Women's Bible Commentary, I was just reading to you one thing that they said that I thought was so poignant. Let's see here. They say what actually happens is, while they're relaxing in the old man's house, the men of the city, a worthless lot, surround the house, insisting that the Levite be brought out that they might know him. Hardly a welcoming committee. Their intent is to torture and humiliate and sport at the expense of the Levite. The old man protests. The men, however, are adamant, and the Levite in desperation seizes his wife and throws her out to the mob. The mob, satisfied with his diversion, leaves the Levite alone and proceeds to gang rape the woman all night long. In the dawn, they let her go, and she stumbles back to the old man's house and collapses at the door. Abandoned by her father, betrayed by her husband, raped and tortured by a mob, the woman is trapped in the world of men. She has nowhere to go but back to the husband who threw her out, only to find that the door of hospitality and safety is still closed against her. That's a tough one. And so, putting her battered body on his donkey, he takes her home. And then when he gets to his house, what is the next thing that he does?
That's right.
He cuts her up.
I believe he was rough on.
This is in the Bible.
Yeah, really.
Right? When he reached home, he took a knife and cut up his concubine, limb by limb, into 12 parts, and sent them into all the areas of Israel. So not only was she abused all night long and abandoned, And then not only did he just say, get up like she was some worthless piece of property, but then when he gets back to his home, he cuts her up and then sends her. You know, they didn't have post mail, FedEx, UPS. He sends her with other people to each of the areas of Israel.
What would be the significance of that?
He sent them to the tribes.
Mhm.
Go,
But
go
I
back to
mean, what is he trying to tell the tribes?
That's a good question. So when you look at the reading of cutting up his concubine, that word there is used in ritualistic language. And so what the author is trying to comment and to make us aware of is that he actually made a sacrifice of her in a weird way. He cut her up like you would a sacrificial animal and sends him out to the 12. And when the 12 receive her, then they say, everyone who saw it said to one another, such a thing has never been seen or done since the day the Israelites came out of Egypt.
Yep, there you
And then they say, we must do something, so speak up. And remember, he's a priest, right? He's a Levite. And so he does his thing. But the interesting thing, as we'll read on, is that his big offense is not that his wife was cut up, but that they were trying to kill him. And so then we read about all the Israelites from Dan to Beersheba, from the land of Gilead, came as one and assembled before the Lord. And they took 400,000 men of swords with them. And then they said at the end of the verse, tell us how this awful thing happened. And so the Levite says, I and my concubine came to Gibeah and Benjamin to spend the night. During the night, the men came around after me and surrounded the house, intending to kill me. Did they really intend to kill him?
Yeah. They were gonna rape him,
Yeah,
probably kill him that way.
probably kill him that way. And so he says that they took his concubine and abused her and she died. And so he took the concubine and cut her into pieces and sent one piece to each region of Israel's inheritance because they committed this lewd and outrageous act of Israel. Now all you Israelites, speak up and tell me what you have decided to do. We have gotten so progressively worse and worse in the book of Judges that it's just sad. If we recount the flow chart that we have of Judges, and what we see over here is exactly what we thought we would see, which is in this section, the last 3 chapters. It's very disturbing. And so I want to get more into discussion instead of just expository reading through the text. So in light of that, is that okay with y'all if we start some discussions? Yes, ma'am.
I just, not many pages later in the Bible,
Mhm.
Saul gets, right after he's been made king, he gets word from the Ammonites that they want to disgrace the Israelites and gouge out one of their eyes, and he's so distressed by the news. He's coming in from his field with his oxen, which kind of surprised me that somebody who is king is still plowing the field, but
Right.
maybe times were different then. And he's so distressed by the news that he sacrifices his oxen and chunks them up in pieces and sends pieces out to all the tribes. So this chunking things up and sending pieces out must have been more common then.
Yeah, I think,
It sounds like a mob.
yeah, it does sound like a mob, right?
But when the purpose was to bring the entire Israel nation to go and to take care of that big problem.
Right.
And that's why they did this, you know.
Right. That's true.
Yeah, well, you send it, it's a message.
Yeah.
You know, what's his name, did the horse in the bed, you know?
Yeah.
It's the same thing, you got a message. You know, she wants to know why you sent a piece out.
Yeah. It was for a message. It really was.
I can't imagine, they didn't have FedEx or whatever, it was like a couple of weeks before they get the summer class. how bad it would be deteriorated by the time they get the arm or leg or whatever. Yeah, like, whoa, what is that?
Yeah.
But then at the beginning too, she had fled from her husband
Mm-hmm.
for 4 months, and then after this happened, she showed up at his doorstep.
And he.
I think I would have showed up with a tit bag in him.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true, like jail. And that is another interesting point. So some scholars, when they're reading into the text, or reading the text rather, they do say that you could interpret the reason of her fleeing is because of domestic abuse. Because I think one translation say that she fled because she was angry with him. The NIV doesn't read that, but maybe the
I
King
thought it
James.
said she was unfaithful, so she fled.
You're right. Mine says unfaithful. Some others may say she was frustrated or angry. But we get into this whole war that happens, right? So all of the Israelites then gather, 400,000 of them, and they, in verse 12, the tribes of Israel sent messengers throughout the tribe of Benjamin, asking, "What about this awful crime that was committed among you? Turn those wicked men over to us so that we may put them to death and purge evil from Israel." So they gathered 400,000, but all they wanted to do was just to get those men, right? And I think the 400,000 could be a hyperbole in the sense of showing you just how important it was to Israel because they've gotten so many people together. But they didn't want to kill the Benjamin tribe, right? They just wanted the men of Benjamin. And that was similar to, remember in Joshua's story, when somebody took from the bounty, when they had conquered the land, they were supposed to destroy everything, and somebody actually took something. Remember Acna in Joshua 7? And he had to get them by tribe, and then by clan, and then by family, and finally it was them, and he write them from the history books. And then remember, the same thing kind of happened with Saul, when Saul was trying to get back at a particular tribe. He had them, he took the people who were responsible for it. And so this is,
tribe was Saul from?
and that's interesting. Saul was from Benjamin. Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin. And so when we read this story, we see how Benjamin was destroyed, how it was rebuilt, and then the first king of Israel came from this tribe. And so we know that they wanted him, but the Benjamites would not listen to their fellow Israelites. And so they gathered together to fight. And then what we see for the next couple of verses is just them going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth and fighting. But in verse 18, this is the first time that they seek God. And the Israelites went up to Bethel. They inquired of God and they said, "Who of us is to go up first to fight against the Benjamites?" Notice they didn't ask, "Should we fight the Benjamites?" They didn't ask, "Should we?" It's, "I've already made the plan, God. Now tell me how to execute it." It's put in the cart before the horse type of thing. And then it's also interesting because if you've read this, then you know that the Israelites put the fault of Benjamin's destruction on God instead of on themselves. And so they asked who of us is to go, and who's the first tribe to go? Judah. That reminds us of chapter 1 in Judges, right? Judah was the first one. And so they lost the first 2 times. Remember? They got beat. So the Benjamites are beating the army of Israel, and they only have like 22,000 people, or 25. And so then all the Israelites, in verse 26, they fast from day until evening, presenting burnt offerings, and they inquire of God. And then they tell us in this little insert, the Ark of the Covenant was there with Phinehas, son of Eleazar, who was the son of Aaron, ministering before it. And so what we have present is actually their high priest, who is Aaron's grandson. So Aaron's grandson is present here. And notice the contrast. You have Moses' grandson was the person who established the shrine in Dan. And now the author is telling us about the history of Aaron's grandson, who is the high priest of Israel. And so the Lord responds, "Go, for tomorrow I will give him into your hands." And so that's exactly what happens. And what they said is in verse 35, the Lord defeated Benjamin before Israel, and on that day they struck down 25,000 Benjamites, all armed with swords. And then after that, those who had been in the ambush in verse 37 made a sudden dash into Gibeah and spread out and put the whole city to the sword. And then as we continue to read, they fled before the Israelites, the Benjamites did, in the direction of the wilderness, but they could not escape the battle. And the Israelites who came out of the towns cut down them. They surrounded the Benjamites, chased them, overran them, and 18,000 Benjamites fell, all of them valiant fighters. And so you see just how total this destruction was. If you want to know more about kind of the number of people that were present during the census, you can see in Numbers just how many people there was. So if you turn to Numbers 26 and 41, we read that at the second census, the tribe of Benjamin had 45,000 men. And they've just cut down close to 40,000 people, if not more.
And also all the women and everybody else was in those towns.
Right,
They didn't have.
right. And that was the other thing that happened too. So if you read in, that was the other thing that happened with the Benjamites. But notice the destruction doesn't just stop there, because when they got the 12 together, there was one tribe that was missing. And what tribe was that? Do you remember?
They did not.
What the Levites?
It wasn't the Levites. It was a particular group of people. Their tribe isn't necessarily mentioned, but it's a group of people.
One that didn't have king.
Look at chapter 21, verse 9.
Jadesh, Gilead.
Yeah.
Kadesh.
Which was this eastern territory of, you can't really see it on this one, but it was the eastern territory of Naphtali or Manasseh up there in the north. Yeah, it'll be East Manasseh. This is where those people were. And so after they killed almost 40,000 Benjamites, they cut down 5,000 more along the roads. So they just about wiped out every single Benjamite that existed, except for, in verse, 47, 600 of them. So you have about 40, maybe 60,000 because of growth, Benjamites, and they wiped them all the way out except for 600 that were left to live on a rock for 4 months. Right. So on the one hand, we've seen just a violation, downright violation of a woman. And then we see the total destruction of a people. And so the men of Israel went back to Benjamin, and not only did they completely wipe out the men, but they went back to all the towns and killed everything, including the animals. So they just wiped out everything. They killed the women.
That sounds worse than the U.S. Congress, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Close.
So this was a genocide, in a way, of the Benjamite tribe, right? So they went to war against Benjamin. They killed their fighting men except for 600. And then they circled back around, right after destroying the main city that they were fighting from, and went back around in Benjamin and completely destroyed every single town and city and killed every living thing present. Even the animals weren't spared. The poor cats that are hiding under the porches, they weren't spared, right? The oxen, they weren't spared. They said, we don't want anything to do with you all. We don't want nothing of yours. We're going to just kill it. And so the men of Israel had also taken an oath at Mizpah. Not one of us will give his daughter in marriage to a Benjamite. So not only did they kill them presently, but those men, those 600 men on the rock, they weren't going to be able to have wives from Israelites. their wives would be foreigners, which was just as bad almost.
So what gave them the compassion to keep those 600? Because they went back and wiped out all the towns, but they left them. And was that because they wanted the tribe of Benjamin to be reestablished?
Those 600 were on the
A lot of
run.
it's, never had.
Yeah.
400,000 Israelites that could have come and
Yeah.
wiped them out.
Maybe somebody did have compassion. Maybe they did.
Something that we don't see in the
Yeah.
chapters.
Maybe they did.
Were they the left-handed soldiers?
It could have been.
What's the significance?
Of being left-handed?
Yeah.
I'm not really sure.
Many of the Benjamites were left-handed.
Yeah, many of them
And it
were.
was that left-handed one who killed,
Yeah.
what's his name?
That
priest.
yeah,
That was kind of killed everybody.
yeah.
That guy.
Because he was left-handed, you watch the right hand, because that's where he usually holds the sword. the left
Yeah,
hand.
Ehud.
You know, one thing that I kept trying to say, why did they do all of this? But my Bible says that if they did not punish the man who did what they had done to the women,
Mhm.
then that whole sin would be put on everybody in Israel. And so they had to punish all of Benjamin so it wouldn't be put under them. That was their justification for going to war.
That's interesting.
That's what I read.
That's interesting.
Maybe I'm wrong.
Yes, sir.
Being left-handed is normally, when you fight, if you're right-handed, your shield's on your left arm.
Yeah.
And your shoulder's in your right-handed. Being left-handed is the opposite way, which really screws up the battle formation,
Yeah, yeah.
and it makes it easier for the left-handed battler or swordsman to, fight a right-handed person because their shield's on the, opposite
So
side.
wouldn't it also be easier for the right-handed guy to fight the left?
Well, but they do it together,
They're really thinking of right-handed people.
It's almost like a southpaw in the Orthodox in boxing.
And same thing in boxing or batting,
Yeah.
it just, it not totally messes it up, but it does mess up the formation.
Yeah, yeah. And I think too, on the side of the left-handed person, you grow up in a world dominated by right-handed people. So you learn how to fight against those persons. So then when you get on a battlefield and somebody has never fought against a left-handed person before, it's just, okay, well, you're gonna lose.
Yeah, it is, not a major advantage, but it's certainly an advantage.
Right, for sure.
Well, where was God during all this stuff?
That's a great question. Where was God during all of this? Where do we see God at?
He's at the donut shop.
At the donut shop.
You know, that-
With the police. But really, when you get down to it, if they disobey God, these things happen.
Mhm.
So you can go back to Abraham and Lot, with Sodom and Gomorrah.
Mhm.
And so when they went into the land, they were supposed to clear out the land.
Yeah,
And so over and over again, when they didn't obey the Lord.
Yeah.
And then in Deuteronomy, well, it gives you all kind of warnings, because once you get in
Mhm.
pretty good shape financially and have a nice house and
right,
not worried about anything, you're gonna forget about God.
yeah.
Does that really refer to the United States today?
So much brutality. But as we say, love one another as I loved you, how can this be?
Mhm.
I know it's a different time, but
Right.
wiping out that many people like that, it seemed like it was
Mhm.
approved by God.
Well, we
Do it
rationalize
to wipe out
that
the
way,
bad
Yeah.
We rationalize that way, but, we're not sure, that's kind of a conception,
Yeah.
I think.
And so, as we continue on, what we read is that, we read about the brokenness of the nation. What they had is, they took an oath at Mizpah, in chapter 21. No one of us will give his daughter in marriage to the Benjamites. That was the oath that they took. And people went to Bethel, where they sat before God until evening, raising their voices and weeping bitterly. Lord God of Israel, they cried, why has this happened to Israel? Why should one tribe be missing from Israel today? Whose fault was it that a tribe was missing from Israel?
The one guy who went and
Okay.
told everybody that he had been wronged by
Mhm.
his concubine being killed.
Yeah, he has a part to play. He has a part to play. The Levite, who chopped her up and sent her. but it's really Israel as a whole, right? Israel was the one who took the oath by themselves. Israel was the one that decided to go out and completely destroy everybody. And even in the beginning, Israel didn't ask God, should we go and fight the Benjamites? And what should we do to them? They've already decided, it was premeditated. God, okay, do I go up today? Who should be the first to go? And so early the next day, the people built an altar and presented offerings and fellowship offerings. You know, when you've done wrong, you try to like do right, right? So for instance, when I was a kid and my grandmother was mad at me or something, I tried to clean up the house pretty good, right? Wash the dishes, sweep a little bit, make granny think that I was a good kid. And so it's the same thing that's happening here. They knew that they completely almost eradicated the tribe of Benjamin, and now they're trying to offer up sweet perfumes and sacrifices to God. And so the Israelites asked, who from all the tribes of Israel has failed to assemble before the Lord? For they had taken a solemn oath that anyone who failed was to be put to death. And so the Israelites grieved for the tribe of Benjamin, and today they said one tribe is cut off from Israel. How can we provide wives for those who have left since we have taken an oath? Then they asked, which one of the tribes of Israel failed? Notice that this is just repeating. So I don't know why this is the case, but verse 5 is repeated through verses 6 and 8. And sometimes when you're reading the Old Testament, it's because an editor has come in and has put something there. It doesn't take away from the text at all, but it just offers a better correction. And sometimes it, as we see here, is maybe a little unnecessary. But it provides more context because they say, how can we provide wives for those that have left? And then they discovered no one from Jabesh Gilead or East Manasseh had come to the camp for the assembly. For when they counted the people, they found that none of them were there. And so notice that they didn't ask God, how should we fix this problem? They then did it on their own. So they said, we have a problem. This whole tribe is cut off. How can we fix it? Oh, you know what? Which one of us didn't come to the tribes gathering? Okay, let's do that. They never asked God, how do we fix this problem? This issue that we have, we cut them off, we're sorry, we did wrong. Tell us what to do. But instead, they decided to do their own thing. Because Israel had no king, so every man did what was right in his own eyes. And so they sent 12,000 fighting men with instructions to go to Jabesh Gilead and put to sword those who were there, including the women and children. Violence begets violence. Exactly.
They saved the ones.
They said, kill every male in verse 11, and every woman who is not a virgin. They found among the people living there 400 young women who had never slept with a man, and took them to the camp of Shiloh in Canaan.
Everybody else was dead with the 400.
Right. So now they've taken probably close to 50,000 because of growth in population or more people in Benjamin. They killed every single person all the way down to 600, leaving them with no wives because they killed the women. Then they go to this other territory and they wipe out all the men and women except for 400 virgins. And so the destruction continues.
Is that, those that they just killed, is that a sub-clan of a tribe?
Yeah,
Is that what
it
it
is.
was?
It is. It is. It's either a sub-clan or a tribe, or you could read it as, I wouldn't read it as a tribe itself, but you could read it that way because when he sent out the 12 pieces, he sent them out to the 12 tribes. And so it could have been a representative or a representative clan of that tribe because they were closest in the area. And so the whole assembly sent an offer of peace to the Benjamites at the rock of Remnant. So they knew they were up there on the rock. And they send them a peace offering and say, let's cease this. And the Benjamites returned at the time and were given the women of Jabesh Gilead who had been spared. But there was not enough of them.
How'd they fight over those?
Right. How did they fight over those? But notice the women had no value. The women didn't have a voice, right? They're virgins. They haven't slept with anyone. They're pure. And because of man's sin and destruction, women are again victims of it.
When they say the people on the rock, is that right there at Shiloh?
That's on Ryman, which is close to Shiloh. And so Shiloh is there up north, and some believe that this rock is this is kind of like the hill country of Ephraim. It's in the eastern part. And so some people believe that it's here on the River Jordan. And I decided to use this map instead of the other one so we can kind of see just the progression of the battle. But there were 600 on the rock. Only 400 were given to them, and so they still had 200 left. And so what happens is, in verse 15, the people grieved for Benjamin because the Lord had made a gap in the tribes of Israel. Did God really make a gap in the tribes of Israel?
What do you mean by gap?
Exactly. What do we mean by gap? What do you think the author means by gap in this text?
Was there a tribe, one of the 12 is gone,
One of the 12 was gone?
that's a gap.
I think that's an accurate reading. And so, do we think that God is the reason why one of the 12 tribes are gone?
No.
Right? How many times have we blamed God for things that are our own fault? Right. We don't blame ourselves, our organization, our groups of people that we hang out with. Instead, we say that it was God's fault. And so the elders of the assembly said, with the women of Benjamin destroyed. Notice there, again, the women were killed. Sometimes women were spared, but in this destruction, women were killed. And so with the women of Benjamin destroyed, how shall we provide wives for the men who are left? Benjamite survivors must have heirs. So notice they see the need. We have to continue this tribe so that the tribe of Israel will not be wiped out. We can't give them our daughters as wives since we Israelites have taken this oath. And they took this oath very prematurely without seeking the guidance of God, right? Putting your foot in your mouth. And so they took an oath, cursed be anyone who gives a wife to Benjamite. But look, there's the annual festival of the Lord in Shiloh, God's holy city, which lies north of Bethel, east of the road that goes from Bethel to Shechem, another holy city, and south of Lebanon. And so look what they did. They needed 200 women to give to the Benjamites so every man can have a woman to give him a child. Notice again the woman's value is in producing a child. And so they instructed them, go and hide in the vineyards in verse 20 and watch. When the young women of Shiloh come out to join in the dancing, rush from the vineyards, and each of you seize one of them to be your wife. Then return to the land of Benjamin. And when their fathers or brothers complain to us, we will say to them, do us the favor of helping them, because we did not give wives to them during the war. In this text, cross-reference it to chapter verse 15. In verse 15, they said, because the Lord had made a gap in the tribes of Israel. That was their complaint and their grief. But here, in verse 22, when they're talking to the fathers of those children, they say, do us this favor because we did not give wives for them during the war. So even in the text, we learn that it wasn't God who caused the gap, but it was the people. And so you will not be guilty of breaking your oath because you did not give your daughters to them. And so that is what the Benjamites did. While the young women were dancing, each man caught one, like they're catching fish, I guess, and carried her off to be his wife. Then they returned to their inheritance, which is their territory, and rebuilt the towns and settled in them. At that time, the Israelites left that place and went home to their tribes and clans, each to his own inheritance. In those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did as they saw fit. So, in the closing chapter of Judges, in these last verses, we read that what Israel had done was they completely wiped out Benjamin, except for 600 people left on the rock. They then went to another town, destroyed everybody except for 400 virgins. And then during an annual festival, they sanctioned kidnapping and one can argue even rape at that point. And then they all went back home as if we're all good here.
Mission accomplished.
Mission accomplished. So, how do you all feel about this?
Yucky.
Yucky. Yeah.
Even from the beginning of the Bible, ever since Adam and Eve
Mhm.
had a problem with the tree, where
Mhm.
the corruption keeps increasing, and
Yeah.
God wipes it out, so to speak, and then it happens again.
Mhm.
And even in Noah, when he got out of the yacht, and
Yeah.
it wasn't too long, the corruption took over
Yeah.
again. And we missed Sodom and Gomorrah way back there
Yeah.
in Genesis. I mean, it goes on, and every time they disobey God, then something terrible ends up happening.
Right.
A lot of those battles that were in Israel, they watched.
Mhm.
God took care of
Right.
hundreds of thousands of people in that way. For the
Yeah.
Israelis.
It's so hard. I mean,
We just can't comprehend that.
yeah.
It is hard. And it's, what's different about these chapters is we've read before of destruction, of chaos. We've seen it before in the story of Judges, but I don't think anywhere in the Bible have we seen it this destructive. And just this violent and this just disturbing, if you will. Yes, ma'am.
I have to sometimes kind of adjust my mindset and go back and remember that back then it was so different because part of it was a matter of your family surviving.
Mhm.
You know, them needing to have all these children and because there was such, people just didn't live. And so you had to have a lot of children. And then also just the way the society was set up, that lineages were so important.
Right.
And you see throughout the Old Testament where they talk about these lineages. Look, nowadays it's different. You adopt somebody into your family. I mean, even if it's not literal,
Right.
we have a couple of people in our family that, we call them, I mean, there's a young man, a little boy that, he calls me Aunt Cindy when he's nowhere at all, my nephew.
Right.
But that's how we live our life today.
Right.
And it wasn't that way back then.
Mhm.
And it's hard for me to relate to, but then I have to remember what I read in the Old Testament.
Right.
I mean, that was their, we have civil law now. And back then, that was kind of just the law. Like when, people talk about how awful it is, in the Bible, if your brother died, you took his wife. Well, that was how she survived. Otherwise, she would starve. And so that was a security system they had in place.
Right.
So he carried the name on.
And also to carry the name, that's right, and also his children, the brother's children would become part of this larger family and be taken care of, and so that's the society they created in order to preserve their family.
Mhm.
And it's just, I have a hard time relating to it because it's different now,
Yeah, yeah.
but it wasn't so odd to them, I guess. What we do now is not odd to me.
Right, right.
To them, I guess this was just the way it was.
Very immoral society.
Yeah, very long.
Don't you think this is all leading up to the cross? I mean, it just shows how necessary it was for Jesus to come to earth and to establish a new morality. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's hard for everybody to understand that everything changed when Christ was crucified.
Right, right.
It changed for the Jews, it changed for everybody, so.
Yeah, it did. Yeah. Yes, ma'am?
I don't refer to these young women as women,
Mhm.
and given that they're virgins, and they haven't already been given marriage, because they gave them away pretty early on to be married, these girls that they're going out and grabbing must be just children.
Mm.
Yeah,
Oh,
they
yeah.
probably are children.
You know,
One of them married at age 13.
It's still happening now with the human trafficking right here in Houston.
That's it. That's a great point.
And I have a little girl and, it's scary.
Yeah.
And this social media stuff is just as bad as having your family belong and accepted.
Yeah.
These young women are thinking, I have to do this, or
Right.
I have to take these pictures of myself and send it to this boy so he likes me, or
Right.
all this. It's still, to me, it's no different. It's just, yeah.
Yeah, it's,
Different, it's the same thing.
and-
So is Christ coming close, like you were saying, waiting for him to come back?
But that happened 1,000 years later when Jesus came,
mhm,
in that period that we were studying.
yeah,
Keith, I noticed the fact that every time something happened in Judges, they said, the Israel had no king, and everyone did as they ought to please. Was maybe all of Judges written in such a way to prepare them to accept the fact to get a king?
mhm,
Because God didn't really set it up for them to have a king. He was going to be over them.
right.
He was going to be the king, but all of it is kind of like a free art. You know?
I think that it is a priming of the pump because people would argue that one of the authors was probably writing from a Davidic time and preparing the people to understand why a king is absolutely necessary. Because if you don't have a leader, then you become your own leader in a sense. And so I was preparing people for maybe Saul, because interestingly enough, out of this tribe that was almost destroyed, the first king comes from this tribe. The lowest of the lowest was the tribe of Benjamin.
It's
And so-
amazing how a tribe that almost been annihilated got the first king.
Mhm.
How is that possible?
Exactly, and it's a story of redemption in a way. But I want us to go back to what was previously said about the culture today, because even though back then you may marry at 12 and 13, what we know today is that those are still children. In that society, maybe the nurture and the context made them mature earlier in a sense, but their bodies were still very much so immature. And one of the things that we see in today's society, I'll just read this to you, and I want to ask you, how does this sit with you? How a father could offer his own daughter as a sacrifice to the lusts of a mob is difficult to understand. Where's me on page 168? Yet many parents today allow their sons and daughters' minds and hearts to be violated by what they see and hear in movies, on television, and at concerts. Chastity of mind and heart is essential for chastity of the body. How does this sit with you? The author is essentially equating what the father did and throwing out his daughter almost as the same as what we may do today, and allowing the gates, the eyes, and the ears, those gates, to remain open to the trash in the world for our children. How does that sit with you? Some of you are parents and grandparents.
It's pretty true, it's everywhere.
Mhm,
Pornography is a multi-billion-dollar industry.
mhm, mhm.
It just seeps in and it's like people just don't even recognize it anymore.
Yeah, that's true.
We read about this back then, and it's horrifying. I think it's worse today,
Mm,
because it's more prevalent, we know about it, and it's everywhere.
Yeah.
It's these kinds of people, it's social media, and it's in the schools, and neighborhoods. It's everywhere, and the kids are exposed to it.
that's so true.
Maybe on the movies and some, and everywhere, but she put it.
Yeah.
But it was on the street corner back then in a temple, you walk by and,
What's the difference between then and now?
That's a great question.
You dressed it up a lot.
What is the difference between then and now?
not a lot. Now you can reach so many more people and
Mhm,
it's quicker than I think it was then.
mhm.
It's not the same people now, it's people you don't even know and,
Well, in relation to violence, World War II killed 40 or 50 million people.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay.
And part of it's so ironic too when we read Judges, it's in so many classes where we're able to identify this is what's happening in America, this is what's happening in our culture. And sadly, even today, we read the same thing because pornography is a $1 billion industry. And so our children are susceptible to that and open to that at earlier ages because of technology, which also can destroy their understanding of human sexuality, their understanding of themselves, their value, and things like that. I mean, I myself was a kid who used to struggle with pornography. and I had friends as well. And the way that it kind of grasps your minds, and it's scientifically proven that it does alter your worldview. And we still have that industry going on. They have a push for pedophilia to become a clinically, how do I put this? Somebody may know it, but basically where pedophilia can be excused because it's a mental disorder. In a sense of, if I'm not mistaken, putting it in the categories of schizophrenia or something like that.
That's the next major push, we roll
Right.
in arms about bathrooms.
Mm-hmm.
And I read that a couple of years ago and I told my daughter that. And
Yeah.
that'll be the next thing we're hearing that, like, they're gonna legislate that pedophiles can't help themselves because that's how they were made. And so we can't just,
Yeah.
It's pretty brutal when judges, but
we still put psychopaths to death.
pretty brutal, but today, I was like, oh, we always hear, love one another as I've loved you. Contrast of kill, and love one another.
Yeah.
Kind of-
We're allowing too many choices and options for people what they want to be.
Yeah.
Instead of.
Yeah.
This is how it is.
Right,
Black
right.
and white, it's too many.
And I think that that's a good point to mention about parenting. I'm not a parent. I hope to be in the next 3 to 5 years and not tomorrow.
I may have other plans.
Right, but I may have other plans. But one of the things that just hit me in what you were saying is the text reminds us in the Bible that all of this is happening because Israel had no king. They did what was right in their own eyes. And so I think it's important for children to know who their king is and what is right, so that the sense of morality or morals is not relative to their own desires and pleasures, but rather that there's an absolute truth in this is the way that you were raised because this is the biblical truth. And so I think when we can give children, and even ourselves, for instance, when we align ourselves with Christ as king, then the rest follows and our behavior begins to change. But in this time, as you see, they didn't have a king. They did what was right in their own eyes. They were the ones who decided we're going to fight the Benjamites. They're the ones who decided we're going to kill off all of them. They're the ones that decided we're going to take this other tribe's versions and give to them. And then they decided, you know what, we're going to allow you to kidnap because the semantics, we didn't give them to you. You kind of took them, right? So one question that I do have, because I don't want to keep us in a dampened mood, because there are people on the other side of the cross, is what evidences of good do you find in these chapters? What evidence of good do you find in these chapters? Is there anything good that can come from these 3 chapters?
For me, it's seeing it and seeing the book of Ruth.
Seeing the book of Ruth.
I think because the only good I can see is we went from judges to a series of kings, and that was a big improvement.
Okay. Going from judges to a period of kings.
Yeah.
Okay.
What stands out in my mind is one man set that all into motion.
Mm-hmm.
One man's decision caused all that death.
Yeah, with the Levite. Yeah, one man's decision.
World War I was started with the guy was assassinated in Austria. One guy was assassinated, started World War I.
It was one guy who started that, but I mean, the tender was there. He wasn't one, someone else constructed an action, caught on fire. It was just waiting to happen.
Just got something in the mail said prepare for the rapture.
We should be glad that we have the 10 Commandments today. One of them
They had the
says,
Ten
"Thou shalt
Commandments
not
then."
kill." They had that,
They had
but
them.
it had to happen, I guess.
Yeah.
George.
George
They
had
had
them.
the 10 Commandments during the
The
judges.
Ten Commandments.
They had the 10 Commandments during the period of judges.
Yeah, I know.
Moses.
They didn't buy it. They didn't go by it.
Well,
Well, we don't know, they don't know.
Well, we had the big covenant.
so because our time here is ended, we've had a great discussion at the end, which is what I was getting to. I think that for me at least, and maybe this is not your answer, it could be the case that nothing good, that's an answer, comes from these chapters because of the destruction that's happening. And for me, when I read it, I don't see the good in it. The good comes after, or rather in the stories that aren't spoken about at the time. So for instance, the book of Ruth, which is what Wiersbe ends on. Wiersbe says that even in the midst of this book called Judges, there is the book of Ruth that talks about characters who are devoted to God and they're trying to do the right thing.
Yep.
And almost in a way, it reminds me that if we think of the book of Judges as the overall culture of America and people having no king and doing what is right in their own eyes, then we as Christians are now the Ruths in society. And what's happened, if you're unaware, what's happened is the church is actually losing the battle in America of winning souls for Christ. It used to be the case where Christianity was the dominant religion, or at least Christianity was a very relevant religion. But in today's society, although 80 to 70% of people may confess that they are Christians, I would bet my bottom dollar that only about 20% of that really are Christians who are sold out for Christ. And that's because of their relationship with God. And so as we depart from here today, the thing I want to leave with us is this statement. In those days, Israel had no king, and every man did what was right in his own eyes. And so for us, as we leave, are we the king of our lives, or is Christ the king? Yes, sir.
Well, Keith, there's one sentence in chapter 12 that rings true to me.
Okay.
When evil isn't dealt with properly, it has a tendency to grow.
Yeah.
And it seems like that's kind of
That's it. That's it.
all.
Yeah. When the evil, and that's a, you know what, I like that way of ending as well. That's a good way to end the class. When evil is not dealt with, it will continue to grow. And as Wiersbe points out, when sin isn't exposed, confessed, and punished, it pollutes society and defiles the land. But when sin isn't dealt with, it will continue to grow. And so I'll close this in prayer today. God, we don't know why this is in the Bible. This is just so tough. We just want to read about your people being good citizens of the world. But it's interesting that the people we read about today are not foreigners. They're not Ammonites, Jebusites. In fact, the Jebusites weren't even involved in this because the Levitical priest did not want to go there. But he went to the land of his own people trying to find safety and refuge. And so in this story, Father, we've seen just the destruction of humanity. We've read about the Benjamites being totally destroyed. We've seen the devaluing of women where a woman fled from her husband to her father's safety just to be given back to her husband. And then she was given out to society for men to abuse her, only to come back to her husband and find the door locked. And so, God, there's a lot of disturbing things in here that we may have residue during the week in dealing with. And so I pray that your Holy Spirit will minister to us as we depart from here. We pray for those victims of the sex trade, God, that you will be God and present in their lives, Father. In the times when they ask, why God, have you forsaken me? In the times when those victims ask, where God are you? Where does my help come from? We just pray that somehow, some way, God, that you will provide answers. And that hopefully, Father God, even if the suffering doesn't end in this life, then we'll have a chance at an eternity of peace and well-being. But it is difficult in this life when we read about all the stuff that goes on in the news. It's difficult to raise children in this day and age amidst all that's going on. And so may you take care of the parents in this room. May you take care of the nurturers and the grandparents, the aunts and the uncles. And may you, most of all, continue to be our King, so that we don't do what's right in our eyes, but we do what's right according to your scripture. Not in what we read in it, God, but what your word actually says is true. Holy Spirit, may you pray for us and be in us and with our families. In the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.